Welcome to the ChatterOps Community Show, the show where we interview an interesting person about the interesting things that they're working on, and then talk to the wider community about those things. I'm your host, Mike Lombardi. Today, I'm going to be interviewing Dustin Collins. Hello, Dustin.
Hello.
So I'm going to ask you the same basic question that I ask everybody I talk to, which is, who is Dustin and what makes you you?
Sure. So I'm 31 years old. I live in Kansas City, Kansas right now. I work for a company that used to be called Conjure and is now called CyberArk. It's a security company. And I really got in. I used to live out in New England, and I really got into the DevOps space out there, up in Providence and then in Cambridge. So I ran the Boston DevOps meetup out there for about 2.5 years, with a lot of help from people, and that experience was has been really invaluable to me. I think going forward, it's like just everything it takes to do something like that. There's so many things that are valuable for me personally and for my career. Specifically, I guess I'm really interested in the connections between things. I'm interested in the things themselves, the connections between things. I'm sure we'll go into that. And then also, I'm a humanist, people first. So I like to make friends and meet people that are also humanists, but not everybody has to be. That's fine.
Sure, that makes sense.
That's me.
Yeah. It's interesting. So one of the things that I did over the last couple of years was I got more involved in the PowerShell community and then the Windowsy side of the DevOps groups. And I tackled running a user group without really knowing what all would go into it. So I'm sure you had a similar experience as far as it looks like so little work up front. Just all they have to do is maintain a meetup page, and then it turns out there's more.
Yeah, if you want to get big with it and have influence, there's definitely a lot more.
Yeah. So you said you're out in KC. Are you involved with the DevOps Days stuff out in KC?
Yeah, I went to the DevOps Days last year. That was a really cool event. I met this is bad, Aaron, I think, the organizer for the DevOps KC meetup. They do monthly, and I haven't been to one in a few moons, but I usually try to get there too because they have they're mixing it up with the format. You know, they're doing not just presentations, but also open spaces and lightning talks and stuff like that. So it's cool to see them really pushing forward too.
Yeah, awesome. So we talked a little bit before all this started. We talked about building safer systems, I guess is kind of the headline. But you mentioned you're a humanist, and I'm going to tie something back in later. Is kind of, I know we're going to touch on it a lot more in detail around the systems themselves, but the idea that I came into DevOps entirely from the humane side of things. I read some studies a couple of years ago that talked about the higher than background level suicide rates, the impacts of stress on health, and a bunch of different pieces of evidence came together for me, and it sort of seemed like if we're not killing people, we're hurting them, right? By the way that we do business in a lot of ways, especially in operations. And so I went looking for a way to make that less awful for people, and that's how I found the DevOps community, was through that look, not from like, let's move faster, let's do, like, all that stuff's great. I'm really happy that it turns out that building systems that are good for humans is also good for business. But I came at it first from that perspective of like, how can we stop making people die earlier than they necessarily need to? That seems like a horrible thing.
Yeah. I think I came through a similar path there. I started more on the development side, like application development. But yeah, you get to a point where there are dependencies you have. I'm talking about like servers or platforms or whatever, and then you need to develop a relationship with these people to, like, not just being just a ticket filer is kind of hard if you don't know the face of the person you're sending the ticket to, in my opinion. So it was very apparent to me as a developer that was, a major problem in operations. So I was starting to look at, what about the things in development? So that really kind of got my ball rolling.
Makes sense to me. So let's flip over a little bit and we'll talk about the thing that we theoretically came here to talk about, right? Which is building safer systems. So when you say safer systems, can you kind of unpack that a little bit for people who may not be as familiar with the terminology, or what you specifically mean when you say a safe system, or how you're measuring safety, and then maybe also what you think of as a system may not necessarily be what some people think of when they say technological system or system in general.
Oh, yeah. That's a big question, but I think we can start with, okay, so pretty much everybody heard about this whole, I think it was Amazon, someone brought down like all of US East 1 by fat fingering a keyboard or something. And then just seeing all of the reactions to that, and there's this typical phrase that pops up, which is human error, in a lot of these news articles that you start to read about it. Some people do a more nuanced analysis, and that's really appreciated. To me, just as kind of a side note, but I play guitar and banjo and ukulele, and like I'm a musical person, so I understand muscle memory. Like, just that when you play music, you don't always have to look at the frets and the strings, and it just takes over. And to think that when we architect our systems and we put them in such a way that is part of somebody's release schedule or the release plan or something, that they have to hit that button to do that release, like I think we'd be doing ourselves a disservice if we didn't think about that, and like, is there muscle memory in that? Because, or wait, why is the person, why did it make sense to that person to do that thing at the time, rather than, you have a huge problem and you automatically assume that there's a huge cause to that problem. Like, that's just human nature. But we already know, like, the people that are close to the metal here, and increasingly more people know that it takes a very, very small change to destroy a lot of things now with declarative infrastructure and automation. So when I mean safer systems, I mean systems that are actually meant for people to operate, and people that people are imperfect. People are going to make mistakes. People are going to not have all the context they need when they make decisions. And so instead of creating systems that require you to be perfect all the time, if it requires you to be perfect all the time, that is something that is ripe for automation, right? Because that's something automation is good at. If you set it up right, it should be perfect every time. So why are we having people do this stuff? Like, when we know machines are better at it, people are better at like coming up with ideas and talking with each other, and actually like they write code too. I'm not part of the code free movement or whatever, but they write code to an end, and people write better code when they know what that end is.
Sure, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think one of the things that you touched on there is something that I felt instinctively when I was doing application administration when I first got started, and that was one of the things, like, well, something caught fire, right, and we didn't predict it, so saying afterwards that we could have predicted it was probably problematic. And we had a couple of, I've taken down production several times, never the same way twice, but several times. And the thing that I always think about afterwards is that if we designed how we do the work in such a way as to assume that the human will get it right every single time, we're betting against reality.
Yeah, we sure are.
So
and we see it all the time.
Yeah, so I wonder, so you've clearly done a lot of thinking around what goes into building that system. So when you said system, it seems to me like you're including not just the technical pieces that connect and that we normally think of when we talk about our application or the systems that we administer, but also all of the stuff around it that is de facto a part of operating and maintaining it, right? So like your change process is part of your system. Your operational behavior and the culture around how you handle operations and escalations and that sort of thing is part of your system. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I definitely think it is, but I think the system is also larger than that, because, okay, so for example, let's say you want people on your operations team to go to at least local meetups, and preferably like some bigger conferences within their areas of expertise. And so now it's this is sort of at the management level, but it also affects the non-management level. And now we have finance involved. Now we have like HR. It starts to snowball when you start trying to get people the context they need to do the best job they can, whether they're in operations or development or marketing or wherever. That these things are all really connected, and it's not always obvious why what we're doing isn't working. But there are sometimes I feel like the tech world is in sort of a bubble somewhat, like, and DevOps is maybe a way to pierce that bubble a little bit, because all of this stuff, like, I'm not just making this up off the top of my head. This is stuff that's already been figured out in other industries, like in more safety conscious industries. Like when I give talks about operations stuff, sometimes at DevOps days, I'll put a quote up and people don't know that it's, people might not know that it is not from an operations book, that's from a nuclear power plants book, like talking about safety. So there's a lot of human knowledge that's outside of the tech bubble that we can pull in to help us, especially when we're talking security, which is my job. Then we start talking safety, and people know a lot about safety outside of tech and inside of tech too, but not all inside.
I think that's interesting. We had a conversation earlier this week when we were doing a sprint retro here at work. One of the things that we talked about is that a problem that IT has had for forever, and let me know if you agree, is that because it was a relatively new domain, right, we assumed that everything had to be recreated whole cloth. Like, well, the things that applied in X don't apply here because it's all brand new. And then as it turns out, no, lots of those things, especially around systems thinking, all the work that came out of Deming and Lean and all that stuff, it turns out, surprise, surprise, that it does apply. And we specifically ended up talking around comparing the way that we do security to the way that airlines and airplane manufacturers do safety, right? Mm-hmm. Probably the first time they do some tests to make sure everything is good to go is not once the plane is flying. When you're rolling, when you're rolling down the end of the runway, then it's probably a little on the late side to be like, let's test this and make sure it's safe. Yeah. Versus, all the other steps where they actually do inject testing and verification and those kinds of steps, and kind of sanity checks. Even when especially when they think that it should be safe, they still go back and do checks anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of bad things happen in the tech world because of a false sense of security. And I don't know. There's a lot of reasons for that, of course, but exactly with the airline industry, like that's another great example of, you could draw a parallel between that Amazon thing we just talked about to this story here, and I talked about this DevOps Days Ohio a couple years ago, but there were these mechanics that were fixing airplanes. I think this was back in the 80s, maybe the 70s, and they kept getting dinged because their oil caps weren't tight enough on the engines. And so the mechanics told their managers that it was because they were too hot, they couldn't touch them to actually physically check it. And so they just let I don't know how many planes they let fly and stuff, but TLDR is that they were too hard on these mechanics, and they ended up with a mechanic shortage in the airline industry. Just because we have compliance, which is great, but people have to agree with compliance. They have to understand the context of that compliance. Because if you don't understand the context of a compliance, you might end up doing things that aren't actually making you more secure. So at the end of that, the mechanic, they switched the oil cap provider. The mechanics had rubber insulated oil caps so they could check the tightness by hand, and everything was fixed. So that was the problem.
That seems like one of those things. I mean, again, in retrospect, those things seem really glaringly obvious, right? It's so much easier to be like, well, why didn't you just do that in the first place? But a lot harder to build the types of organizations that look at it, see those kinds of things, and then go, oh, hey, before it becomes one of those things where, it becomes an anecdote for a talk later.
Yeah. Post hoc judgments are not like, they're useful, but only in a certain respect, and that's like the start of the snowball into blameless postmortems. Why people should do those, because it's not always obvious, and it's always obvious in retrospect. But when people say it's always obvious in retrospect, that's a lens. That post hoc analysis is a lens into the truth. And when we start talking accountability means that people need to share their stories. And so if you're punishing people in these blameless postmortems, even if you call them blameless and you find little ways to blame people, it's just working against you, because now you have unknown problems where instead you could have had known problems.
Yeah, I mean So one of the really good examples, for me, it was one of those things that was like a horrifying read. I don't know if you caught the post on the sysadmin subreddit it was like a week or 2 weeks ago, where a guy, his first day on the job, he's going through documentation, and then the documentation included directions for wiping out a database and putting dummy data in. But in the documentation, it included the connection for the prod database and the credentials. So they just copied and pasted and blew it all away.
Yeah, I did see that. I think our manager posted it on our Slack channel. Yep.
Yeah, from my perspective, because they also, I think if I remember right, that backups weren't working too, right?
Yeah, the backup and recovery procedure wasn't tested, which is a pretty common thing, unfortunately.
Sure. So, I mean, better to learn that under those circumstances than, in 6 months or a year or whatever. So I kind of want to, because I remember we touched on this a very, very little bit, and you mentioned something that kind of made me remember it. You talked about what happens when we investigate failure modes, right? So I think you probably fall into the camp that sees those as learning events rather than a time to kind of, find the person who did the bad thing and go punish them.
Yeah, I think, we're working really, really hard to set up these learning environments for people in our organizations, but that's us going halfway, right? Now the people with these environments, then they have to come halfway and actually participate and excel in these learning environments. That's what we want. So they should be blameless, but I think a lot of people get confused about this point because they think that blameless means no accountability. But I think, back to accountability is actually people sharing their accounts. If they don't get that chance, even if it turns out that they were, reckless or egregious or whatever, if they're not able to fully share their account, what other people can learn from it, not in like a not for public eyes closing interview, or what do they call those? I forget. When you leave a company, you have to do the interview.
Exit interviews?
Yeah. Those usually don't get shared with the team, in my experience. So that there's learning going on, but it's only learning from one person's perspective, where the why we sit around in circles and do these blameless postmortems and stuff is to get a lot of perspectives. Like it's starting to become just a fact that the state of our technology and what we're trying to do with it and the speed we're trying to achieve. We can't. The number of problems that can be solved from just one perspective are growing exceedingly small. I think you might be on mute.
Yep, absolutely. So I just finished reading Anti-Fragile. I wasn't a huge fan of the way the book was written. It takes a lot of detours into ad hominem and yelling at people and those kinds of things, which, whatever. The main thing for me was kind of the combination of talking about how the more things you add to a system, the more complex that system gets. By the nature of systems, the harder and harder it gets to predict failure modes. They're going to wipe you out, and they're going to cause all kinds of issues. And the smaller those errors can be that cause those problems, right? It ceases to be the case where, like, somebody has to go throw a grenade in the data center, and starts being things like, oops, I accidentally changed something in a config and set things on fire. And then talking about building systems where they have either a resilience against those kinds of failure modes, or you're designed in such a way that you can learn from them quickly and kind of adapt. So I was looking at it mostly from a work perspective. He applies it to every single domain under the sun. But
Yeah.
From the perspective of what we do for day jobs, it seemed to me like there's a huge advantage in being able to take something that broke us or hurt us or impacted us, and being able to take that and use it to improve and make sure, one, it doesn't happen again, or if it does happen again, the chances have been reduced, that kind of thing. But two, also, usually it seems to me like every time we've seen a failure mode, it's because of something we didn't know about beforehand. There was something that we hadn't been accounting for when we were doing our plans and simulations. And so it teaches us about those environments and the systems that we're working with in a way that I don't know that you can really learn without catching on to those kinds of problems.
Yeah, this comes up sometimes when people are trying to get into DevOps or trying to get into sysadmin or development. It's hard to say something like go learn Jenkins, because a person running a home lab with Jenkins, sure, there's some valuable experience there, but there's a lot of things about not just Jenkins, but any CI/CD system that only like the emergent behaviors from teams working in them. I don't know. You kind of got to actually do it to get that experience. You can't shortcut that.
And it's not like that experience comes without cost, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I think another confusing point, I think I've heard a lot from the point you previously brought up about like, okay, yeah, so we're working with really complex systems. There's a little cause and there's a big effect for most things we do these days. So it's also that it's becoming more and more obvious to me that it is also that way with organizational cultures, where, and usually because it's kind of like we start to talk about these sort of things and then people are like, well, what am I supposed to do? Like that's what we sit around in open spaces and say to each other. But it's not a big problem. It's a lot of little problems. And in 2017 phrasing, like microaggressions are killing our cultures. Because if you try to set up your blameless postmortems and get all this stuff going, you're automating your infrastructure, but then you're still tying people's salaries or jobs or whatever to mean time to failure instead of recovery, then it kind of just undoes a lot of work, that work that you just tried to do.
Sure, and that comes back to your point earlier that everything that we do around the work is part of that system, right? We can't pretend like some of the incentives and disincentives in our organizational culture don't matter. And I'd like to touch more on, I wonder, so I haven't been anywhere that's been super on board with the idea of the restorative versus retributive justice in their organizational culture. So I was kind of wondering if you have any thoughts on that. But before we dive into it, I just kind of want to give you the heads up that I'm going to publish the link for everybody else to join in if they feel so inclined. So we should have people pop up or whatnot, maybe. If not, we can keep talking. It's fine.
Yeah.
So I guess while we're waiting for people to pop in, what are your thoughts on the retributive versus the restorative? It kind of seems to me like you're probably more in favor of the latter.
Yeah, I think people work better in a restorative rather than a retributive just culture, because if you want to make the business case for it, it's like if you want to run progressive technology companies, and I mean progressive not in a political state of the nation right now in a sense, right, but progressive, and you want to be a market leader or you want to be a disruptor, like a retributive just culture is the status quo right now. Like it's not what everybody's doing, but a lot of people are doing it. And so you're saying that you want to push your companies past the status quo, you want to be leaders, then you can't act like you're in the status quo. Like the research is all in. Like you just got to evaluate it and be willing to evaluate it.
Yeah, I can't remember if it was actually Sidney Dekker that said it, or if it was somebody I was talking with about Sidney Dekker, but we're talking about the fundamental difference in viewpoint between the two, right? Retributive mostly looks backward, and restorative mostly looks forward. And I think that has quite a bit of impact on how you do a lot of the work in your organization, right? Are you so caught up in how did this happen, and why did we let this happen, or whose fault is this? Or are you focused more on like, hey, that thing happened, let's make that not happen again. I'd like it if we didn't actually include the production details in our onboarding document that people could copy paste. That's probably bad.
Yeah. The nice thing about all this is that companies increasingly have less and less of a choice in this matter, because there are companies that are the leaders in their sectors are adopting at least some of the traits of a restorative just culture and are leading. They're the ones doing the faster deploys, the more frequent or less frequent downtimes. Like it's going to be increasingly harder to compete as a business with a retributive just culture, is my opinion.
It's one of the things that a lot of the people I talk to now, when they're looking at where they want to go for their next job, or when they're looking at what are the organizations that I want to even bother responding to, right, when they reach out to you, a lot of that comes back to, hey, how do you treat people when things go wrong? Right? If I'm going to give you hours and hours and hours of my life, I want to know that I'm giving you those hours in good faith, and that I'm going to get some kind of positive kind of behavior back in turn. Like, you're going to trust me to run systems. I want to be able to trust you not to burn me while I'm running those systems.
Yeah. Yeah. You can't just decide that your company can stay out of alignment. But if you want to use the word alignment, you can't allow your company to be out of alignment, or can't be actively working towards bringing it into alignment all the time.
So what have been your experiences around sort of adjusting from a more retributive culture into a restorative one? Is it something you just have to abandon and go find the place that already has it, or have you had experience kind of working through those things? Or did you try it and give up, or what does that look like for you?
I've had a bunch of different experiences by now. I mostly work for startups and a couple of bigger companies. And it's always a little tough with startups because, everybody's just fighting for survival and things get weird sometimes. That's been my startup experience, like, since I started. More or less. Not to say that's bad. It's just part of it. That's what you're signing up for. But I think just one great way to kind of force, like, you can't, I kind of worry sometimes when I see like DevOps mandates or like really big long year plans where everything is kind of figured out in the phases before we even try to do it. Just because, again, it's the little cause, big outcome thing where, for example, just raising the visibility of the pain of your work. Like, for example, I think just the transition from email to like chat clients was pretty huge for this, because now like the sales guys are pinging you in Slack asking for like materials they need, and it's like, oh, they've been asking me every week for a long time now, like how can we make it easier for them to get their materials? Just providing easier ways for people to communicate with each other is kind of pouring gas on the fire that we want to start. And it's a fire with a phoenix in the middle, right? It's not just a destructive fire. So, and raising visibility into our systems, into our CI systems, especially like the units of delivery in our organizations. Once people can actually get an eye on that and track it, then they start maybe complaining about why does this step take so long instead of that step. And it's like, thank God you're saying it, because I've been saying it for a year now, but now there's a bunch of people saying it. So again, it's the gas on the fire. You can't do it all yourself. But I think whether you can fix somewhere you are or move is like kind of a really deeply personal decision for every person, because you kind of got to do that math in your head and figure out if it makes sense for you. And there's a ton of variables there. But I have seen it done. I think there's hope. to do that. I've seen it done well. It takes longer than anybody wants it to, but if you can kind of if you can, I like the phrase, find the thread, you can unravel the whole ball. You just got to start trying to look for those threads.
Makes sense. It's pretty good advice. So we actually have a question from one of the viewers, Glenn Sardi, wants to know, what about restorative and retributive cultures in regulated industries, like such as with finance, right? So how do you do disclosure, and what does that look like?
Disclosure of what? Sorry, I don't understand.
I'm assuming around errors or failure modes or breaches. It's not really clear. Glenn may pop in and clarify for us a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe if he doesn't answer, I can talk to it from a security perspective, maybe, because there's a lot of companies under pretty heavy compliance that I have some experience working with. And the interesting thing about when you even if you go back and look at it, it's really interesting sometimes the idea people have in their head of what like HIPAA or NIST or ISO, whatever numbers you want, mean, because we've kind of formed like, especially security teams kind of form folk compliance, I guess, is what I would say, where it's kind of like, oh, I heard somebody say this back a while, so we're just going to keep doing that, and then this all kind of piles on. Like, it pays to pay attention to the reference, to the source, because you might not, and they change too, like they update as you go. So what you used to have to do back in the day, maybe you don't have to do anymore. With the things that you do have to do, like Kevin Gilpin, like the CTO of Conjure, like when he said this, I was just I don't know. The number one blocker to compliance is visibility. People need to have visibility into how their security systems are working, what they're doing for them, the safety nets that they're providing for them, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to provide a safe environment for people to innovate in, right? And so it's not just one big safety net. It's a bunch of little safety nets like trapeze all over the place. But there's definitely a lot of ways to remain compliant. And by raising visibility, make sure you're beyond compliant. Like we did the compliance, that's table stakes now. We've also done this for our customers.
It sounds like it's probably one of those journeys that everybody wants to go through. Nobody wants to go through the journey, right? They just want to get to that destination at the end where they're like, yeah, everything's compliant, and we've gone past that. Yay!
Yep.
So I kind of want to bring things back a little bit to around building those safer systems. So what are some of the fundamentals, aside from what we were talking about around culture and making sure that we learn from those failure modes instead of missing out on them? What are some of the fundamental pieces of building a safer system, and what can we kind of take away and start working on?
Yeah, well, I think if you kind of lump the security work you have to do in with all of the other best practices that are coming out of DevOps, it starts to become more and more clear. Like, so the people in DevOps will say, make sure your environments are the same, or at least as consistent as possible. You might have to munch some databases and stuff, I don't know, but they need to be as close to similar as possible. So the security stuff isn't outside that. Like if you're going to be running a security system in production, run the same one in staging, run the same one in development, whatever your environments are. Like if your security vendors or your tooling don't allow that sort of scenario, they're working against you, and maybe you should look for someone else. And that also flows down into the developer workflow. And this is a little more pushing the edge, I guess, but we shouldn't be using different security tools in production than development. Like we shouldn't, like to your point earlier, when people have run books and their documentation, but you know how if you get really fancy with the markdown, you can make really nice little red panels that say never do this in production. Like, why are we building, like, we're building it for convenience, but there are really good ways that tools and systems can be built that offer an actual balance of security and convenience that errs more towards convenience, that don't make you make these sort of compromises.
It's the one of the classic examples in Windows land, right? Is when people are doing dev work and they're like, oh, I'm not going to give it, I'll just self-sign the SSL, whatever. And like, that'll be fine. And then a lot of the things that they were ignoring, the revocation checks and the certificate names and all that stuff, come back and bite them when they move to prod, or they just, deploy to prod with self-signed certs and hope no one notices.
Yep.
Like, that's not going to be an issue later.
Yeah. So I've kind of put my effort into this. I wrote this tool as part of Conjure called Summon that basically it reads a secrets.yaml file that it's a command line tool, so you can say like summon Ansible or summon Chef or summon Puppet or summon Docker or whatever your tool is. It'll read your secrets.yaml file, which is a mapping of environment variables to a path where a secret is stored. Summon has pluggable providers, Conjure, S3. People are writing custom providers for it now. I don't even know what's all out there. But you can use that same tool for locally to run your test kitchen stuff when you're developing Chef cookbooks. You run it on your CI servers. The secrets are never left on the system is kind of the big point here, whether they're files or strings. They're thrown away once the process exits. So use that locally, use it in Jenkins, use it in dev, use it in prod, like just carry it all the way through. And if it's not the right use case for the app that you want, well, not one tool is going to fit all of our use cases. Now we start to get into this where we're like, well, we want to run EC2 instances, but we also want to start playing around with Lambda. Oh, but we also have an OpenShift deployment that we're trying out. So there do become sort of, it's kind of like the Unix philosophy, right? One tool that does one thing well, like you chain them together, but that's dangerous maybe a little bit because people tend to get lost in the words and forget the ideas behind like what we're actually doing. And we start to get into like fights about Ansible versus Chef, or I'm sure you've been in many of them yourself. They're just it's good to point out differences that people might not know, but the outcome of those is not something that I think should be a goal of the conversation.
So that's a really good point. I mean, so many times we end up rabbit holing around, is this the best tool? Is this the tool that we absolutely should use? How do we know this is the tool we should absolutely use? It's the right tool for all the cases. And I think one of the things that I've gotten hung up on before, I won't speak for other humans, but I've gotten hung up on the idea before, like I have to solve it as close to perfect as I can each time I go to solve a problem, instead of being like, well, what's the gap between where I am now and the risk that we've identified so far? Can I start closing those risks or improving things now? Because I can always go back, right? And to a certain extent, I can improve on the thing that I set up. But sometimes I feel like people get caught up in that kind of analysis paralysis around how do we secure things and what is the best way to handle secrets in our environment, instead of just being like, well, stop putting them in plain text everywhere first. Pick something that lets you do that.
Yeah, and if you're using etcd, well, it stores its passwords by default in plain text, so you might want to think about that too.
There's at least one person listening who's like,
I gotta go. Let me drop off quick. Yeah, part of the thing that I'm thinking about now, listening to you talk about this, is, this isn't a very popular opinion maybe, but standardization is trying to standardize all of an enterprise or all of an organization on a single tool might be good sometimes, but often it's not the right thing to do. Whether it's your monitoring platform or your source control repo, we can do it for convenience, right? This needs to be a compromise. But look at the way that containers have taken off in the past few years. And that's all about run Ruby, run Node, run Java. I don't care. It'll run it all. And that's what people want. And that's, not containers aren't good for everything. I would never say that. But that explosion that you see in the container world is like a direct result of people like railing against standardization. We want to use the new stuff. We want to try things out.
Well, I think in a lot of cases when we try to standardize that kind of like somebody pick the tool for everybody, one of the problems is that you're fighting human nature when you do that, right? Yeah. Somebody somewhere learned Puppet before they learned Chef, and they never ever want to switch. And then somebody else thinks that they're both stupid and we should be using salt everywhere. And yep. Trying to get, especially if those are thought leaders on their teams, one of the conversations I've been having a lot with people recently is like, well, how are you doing configuration management now? Well, somebody logs in and makes a change. Okay, I don't care which one you pick or if you standardize across the groups, but let's try to not do that, right? Let's take steps towards a safer, kind of more repeatable workflow and try to pull out some of those things that are really accident prone that we're doing right now. And we can, look back at, because so much of the work that goes into configuring stuff is transferable across those tools. It's not like it's an easy transfer, right? But from my experience, what I've seen so far has been that a lot of it is a combination of archaeology and then deciding what should make it into those baselines. So yeah, if you start with salt and you decide salt was terrible, let's switch. You're in a position now where you're like, well, at least we know what we want those configs to look like, and we can go build it instead of trying to mine it all over again.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't used salt yet. I would like to maybe, but I've used the other three. And when somebody comes and asks you, like, what's the best config management tool? It's like, well, I'm using Ansible right now, but I'm not saying you should use Ansible. Like, I don't know your environment. I don't know what you're dealing with.
Yeah, like so much of what I've heard back from people in the community has been like, just as there is no one right perfect way to do a culture, there's no one right perfect way to do Agile, there's no one right perfect set of tools for you. There's whatever makes sense in the context of your organization, your business, your teams, your people, right? And that very rarely will be the exact same across any two different groups of humans. It's just very diverse.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring up Agile, because if you look at the stats of Agile, Agile is always about people. Agile is at its core a humanist manifesto is what they called it. But if you look at what happened with Scrum, and like I've done Scrum before, I don't have any particular problem with Scrum. Practice well. But look at all of the Scrum Masters that are Scrum certified. That number is so much larger than the certified Scrum developers number. Like, I don't even think we've crossed like 6 figures on that number. So it'd be great if, someone went and got the training and then had the actual time and resources to like kind of be an evangelist for it for the team. But usually it's, it's good for the person, but there's often not the learning. It's too focused. Like, if it's not just one person that does Scrum and the developers like just follow along. Like, if people don't understand why they're doing something, they're not going to do it. It's as simple as that.
So I have much and many opinions on this, because it's something that we've been doing since the start of this year is trying to change the way that we did our work, trying to make our workflow a little bit easier from the infrastructure side and the engineering side. And one of the things that we talked about was we've been experimenting with doing sprints around the infrastructure engineering that we've been working through. And the overwhelming things that everybody loved about the process, the thing that we get feedback on the most, was the visibility and the clarity, not just of what work is happening by who and when and all that stuff, but how it relates back to anything else that's happening in the environment, right? Putting it in terms that makes it clear who it's for and why it matters made a huge difference to everybody as far as getting along with it. So even if we change any of the other stuff out, there was a lot of interest around keeping those things intact and making sure that we don't lose the clarity and the visibility that we gained over the last 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of ties a bow in the knot of like we had talked about standardization and we talked about visibility. And I think the interesting thing that's going to happen in the next year or two, and maybe it's already happening, I just need to learn about it, but we need to figure out how to not have to standardize everything and also provide that same level of visibility. And that's not just for like Jira versus Pivotal Tracker, that's also for your security systems and your monitoring systems and your emails, maybe, I don't know, whatever people, everybody's got to be rational, sane adults about this and be willing to compromise. But if people aren't, if people don't know why they're doing what they're doing, I'll qualify it. They might do it for a while, up to a point, and they're not going to do it every time because it's really not that important to them. And so this is important in that conversation because one of the things that, you know, I don't like to do, and I know the people that I work with don't like to do, is double book things. Double book an issue in GitHub, double book an issue in GitHub, and then put it in Jira. Put it here, and then also put it there. Make sure the text is the same, because you know that should be automatic. People shouldn't have to do that.
And it always feels like it's there's something about it that feels like whoever set that process up didn't respect your time. If they set up a process that was going to require you to go do the same thing 2 or 3 times manually in different places, even though the information is large. I mean, so like a good example of that would be if you're filing an issue wherever it's more verbose, either in GitHub or the tracker, right? The other one could just be the link back and be like, hey, you know, it exists over here, right? Instead of being like, make sure everything's all prettied up and matching or whatever. Yeah, we struggle with that sometimes too, and I never really have great answers around it because in some cases the people who are moving forward don't have, especially depending on the size of your organization, right? There are processes and procedures which have lived longer than you and are hard to kind of turn. And so one of the things that we've been talking about as we move forward and we look at how we treat documentation, I've been doing what I can to convince people that we need to treat our documentation as seriously as the app dev teams treat user experience, because it functionally is user experience, right? But not just for the people that rely on our infrastructure, for the people operating it and maintaining it. If you onboard somebody into your team, their experience with your team is also very much influenced by the documentation you provide them. So as we look at doing that, I have exactly zero leverage to go out across all the cases and tell them, now you will do documentation thusly, and you will treat it like this, and it will look like this, and this is where you'll do it, and here's the toolkit, and blah, 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 blah. But what I can do is work with people to do better documentation. And if people end up standardizing around the things that we're talking about and we're showing value from, great. If they improve their documentation on their own in other ways, great. As long as we're moving the needle on improving how it is for everybody, I'm less picky.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, sometimes things come out of retros that, you know, we all want to do as the developer team, right? Those things are pretty often come out in retros. But people need the time and the resources and the incentive, but to change their behavior. Sometimes when the behavior is really deep seated, as in like this has been around longer than me, like the momentum is a problem, and it takes effort to obtain momentum. And so if you're trying to reverse the momentum on a decision that was made previously, and you're also trying to ship every day, like, you got to figure that out, because you can't just expect people to put in, you know, what's the saying? Twice the effort all the time. Twice the effort all the time, yeah. Twice the effort half the time. Something like that.
It reminds me of that the idea of, you know, you've got to do more with less. And you keep hearing that over and over and over, do more with less, until at a certain point it's like, well, do we do more with less, or do we do what we're already at capacity with? And then that capacity is going to decrease if you keep decreasing. But one of the things that I've always found really interesting is that people seem to be able to adopt new approaches, not just when they understand it, but when they understand, because the way we're wired, narratives around it, right? Like, not only does documentation matter for all these abstract reasons, as an example, but it also matters because, if you win the lottery tomorrow, you're going to want to leave, and are you going to feel good about leaving with all of this trapped knowledge that is going to leave everybody else in a lurch, right?
Yeah.
Or if you had to bring your best friend onto the team, would you be happy about the state of how we would do that and what that experience would be like for them? Is that something that we're comfortable with?
So something we've done for a little while, we had been doing it at Conjure, and now we're continuing to do it at CyberArk, is experience-driven development, where we really nail the experience first of what we're going for, whether it's syncing an LDAP directory or do an automatic rotation of secrets, like really focusing in on the people that have to do this. I got a name drop Dan Warner here. He's a really cool UX guy that taught me a lot about, taught our whole team a lot about this whole process. And we've already been through, we've done this process for our Puppet module. And just from beginning to end, the way that people can use that module, the review process to get it Puppet approved, it was all so much easier and better because we had figured out the experience off the bat. Doesn't mean you have to do that for every singular task, but I think for large kind of pushes you're trying to do, the experience-driven development might be something to look into.
Yeah, and I think it takes some of those ideas that we've been talking about a lot in the DevOps community for a while now, right? And it doesn't count until it's being used in production, and just kind of takes it that other step further. Being used in production assumes that the user experience was at least good enough that people were willing to do it, right? Because you could have the greatest tool on the planet, and if it makes me, want to go home and have a scotch, then it's probably not going to see widespread use. So it makes that more explicit. If I have a great feature of my product, but nobody ever uses it because nobody understands how, or using it is painful, was it a great feature?
Yeah, or does it need more work, or does it need cut? Yep. Yeah, I think that kind of reminds me of that, back to the Amazon, or not the Amazon, but the story about the kid that posted on Reddit that got fired from his job. It's why are backup and restore procedures hard? Well, why don't you look at the backup and restore documentation for MySQL, or Postgres is a little better, but it's still kind of it's hard because things change fast too. You can't just go to a blog post and do it because that information might be old. So, maybe they are, but companies could be even doing more to make that easy, or maybe, if they're not going to do it themselves, partner with another company that they can then work with for their customers or whatever. That backup restore, people don't do it because it's hard, and then everything goes to crap.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've been talking about with people quite a bit. When I was up in Seattle a couple of weeks ago, we talked a little bit about the 3 types of documentation. And one of the things that I pointed out is that this is particularly bad in the open source world, where I'm quite a bit more forgiving, right? Because they don't have money to go out and hire technical document writers. But pretty much, I would say the majority of projects out there have middling to good reference documentation. They all have a bare minimum level of narrative documentation. And then almost all of them completely abandon concept docs to the wind and just say, somebody else will figure out what this is supposed to be when you harden it, or what that looks like, or whatever. Or my favorite is the paragraph that says, when you're using product X, make sure you think about the security implications and you ensure that your surface area is reduced. You're like, well, yeah.
Good luck.
But could you tell me what that surface area is so I know?
Yeah. Yeah. And how have you expanded my surface area by choosing you? Exactly.
Right. Oh, and there's one of the other things too is that so many people rely on outsiders to write narrative documentation for them, right? It's that almost every open source product is like this. They'll do how to install it, how to solve for the use case that the maintainer and the original writer needed, and then after that, they're really, really hoping that people will use it and write blog posts about it.
Yeah.
Because the docs are hard, and keeping them up to date is hard, and writing them is a skill that doesn't necessarily overlap very much with people who are doing writing code. It's a completely different set of skills, being able to take how you interact with something and translating that into a narrative experience that people can really grok and dive into versus, how did I, run the install script, or how did I, use PyPy, grab this, run this command, and you're done.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Well, I think, it is a skill, but there's nothing about, there's so much pseudoscience going around about, like, okay, so Scarlett Johansson came out with that whole use 100% of your brain thing, which has always been garbage. Continues to be this whole thing about left brain split, which has also been debunked. This is another, like, it's just not how we work. It's just, it's obvious in retrospect or from the outside or whatever, maybe sometimes, but we don't do very good when we're like, when we're not acknowledging our human nature.
Yeah, I agree completely. Well, that's one of the things you mentioned is always been a side interest of mine, and we are coming up on time, but you have two modes of thinking, right? Fast and slow, right? And Kahneman and Tversky have done a lot of work around this area, and there's tons and tons of evidence all around us for like how our brains work, and that there are biases and heuristics. So one of the things that I kind of want to bring us all the way back to safer systems again is building systems with the human behavior modes in mind, right? So if I'm going to if I'm going to write a document that walks you through standing up product X, instead of the fastest way to stand up product X, I'll just walk you through the default sane, safe way to set up product X, right? Make sure that I include all those things that you're actually going to want to have in production, because there's a really good chance once you've run through my narrative, that's what's going to run in prod, whether or not that's what I wanted you to do or not, right?
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things I think about quite a bit, and I think we have to design our systems to take into account how people are going to interact with them from that perspective.
Well, here's something I do when I write infrastructure or whatever code. I usually try to open source it so other people can read it without having their GitHub repo outside of the dev team, because one of the things that I also like to do is to dog food our product with our internal infrastructure. And what happens when you do that, you start building up actual example repositories, use cases that are already production secured. And if you have salespeople that are technical enough, which is what you want to have for some of these things, like I just give GitHub links. Like maybe I'll do a hangout for an hour or something with someone from the sales team. But it's just like, look at all the parts of this. We're using our product here, 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 here. Here's all the little gluey bits. And this might sound terrifying if you're not from a technical background, but it's mostly an ideas talk. Like, let's talk about the ideas you already know. Let's hone those ideas by looking at this actual piece of code and not just some quick start hello world example.
Yes, 100 times yes to that. I can't tell you how many times we have conversations. It's one of the things that you like, that the lack of that information is in a lot of cases why people do POCs, I think.
Yeah.
Because they're not just proving, because if I look at the documentation, it's like, oh, you can stand it up without any security in place at all. It's all local accounts on the server. Okay, well, if I had to guess, the PCI auditors aren't going to be super jazzed about that, so let's try something different. And then you do the POC, like, can I make it work with the security constraints that I have, versus just having those conversations and seeing, like, yes, there are real-world examples, and yes, there is an understanding of how to get there.
Yeah,
that's actually a really cool thing.
Yeah, it's much easier to have a real, honest conversation with someone when you're running the software that you're talking to them about. Like, all the dark corners and the things that we need to work on and the things that are actually pretty great right now. Like, that makes my job going to conferences and talking to people about security stuff so much easier, because I'm still close to the metal. I'm still doing it. We can talk about it.
That is really, really cool. I'm really glad to hear it. I've had a blast talking. Is there anything else you want to make sure we cover before we wrap up?
Just check out devopsdays.org If you do not know what that is, type it in and check it out, and there's going to be something near you that might be pretty cool for you.
I will go ahead and update the show notes with that information as well. I already dropped Summon in there. I don't know if you noticed.
No, I am not looking at the same thing.
So I really, really appreciate your time. I appreciate you answering all the questions and going through all this with us. I think there's a lot of value in here, and I'd love to chit chat later. I'm really glad we got this chance.
Yeah, this has been really fun. Thanks for providing the opportunity.
Hey, no problem. It was good to talk. It was good to kind of, I think some of these ideas people have said before, right? Well, almost everything we've talked about is not super original, but I think exposure to those ideas and hearing more people talk about it is one of the only other ways to move that needle.
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, I'm going to go eat since I haven't eaten all day, and I will. I really do appreciate it. Have a great night.
Hey, thanks. You too. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.